Before tonight's kickoff, we would like to take a few moments to honor and remember our military rugby teammates who not only represented their service branch on the rugby field, but also our country on the battlefield. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please stand as we conduct our roll call of the names of the fallen rugger teammates who paid the ultimate sacrifice. The United States Army, Major Guy Baratieri, Lieutenant James Brierly, Lieutenant Ben Britt, Lieutenant Randy Castro, Lieutenant Dimitri Del Castillo, Chief Warrant Officer Nicholas Dimona, Chief Warrant Officer Stephen Dwyer, Lieutenant Joey Enig, Sergeant First Class Michael Fuga, Sergeant First Class Justin Goff, Staff Sergeant Robert Goodwin, Specialist Ryan Grandstaff, Lieutenant Chris Greer, Captain Jim Gerbitz, Specialist Christopher Harris, Colonel James Harrison, Lieutenant Chuck Hemingway, Lieutenant Haley Hodson, Captain John David Hortman, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Jensen, Captain Quincy Johnson, Sergeant Donald Lamar, Sergeant James Landreth, Lieutenant Weston Lee, Staff Sergeant Jeff Lowe, West Point Class of '82, Lieutenant David Lodwick, Sergeant Terry Lynch, Lieutenant Tom Martin, Corporal Stephen Michael McGowan, Lieutenant Zach Miller, Specialist Avealeo Milo, Sergeant First Class Matthew Nyman, Lieutenant Bill Pahisa, Lieutenant David Sackett, Sergeant First Class John Sanchez, Captain Bob Cerrillo, Specialist Cody Sisk, Captain Christian P. Skoglund, Captain Garrett Slaughter, Major Robert Soltis, Captain Scott Spaniel, Chief Warrant Officer Chris Thibodeau, Lieutenant Claire Thurston, Sergeant First Class Frank Tia, Lieutenant Laura Walker, Staff Sergeant Kyle Ray Warren, Captain Ian Weichel, Sergeant First Class Dom Butchis. The United States Marine Corps, Major Dan Engelhoff Jr., Sergeant Bronson Babcock, Lieutenant Colonel Brett Becken, Lance Corporal Richard Bersetta, Lieutenant Colonel Justin Constantine, Lance Corporal Chris Cosgrove III, Lance Corporal Michael Glover, Major Jeremy Grazik, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Green, Major Ryan Hansen, Lance Corporal Eric Hertzberg, Sergeant Christopher Jacobs, Sergeant Donald Lamar II, Sergeant Aaron Lawson, Major John Lee, Captain John Maloney, Staff Sergeant Joshua Moore Jr., Major Kevin Nave, Corporal Ron Payne, Gunnery Sergeant Cap Pelletier, Captain Michael Quinn, Captain Patrick Rapico, Captain Candace Ruiz, Major John Ruocco, Staff Sergeant Joshua Sanchez, Sergeant Adam Scholler, Staff Sergeant Andrew Safe, Lieutenant Christopher Shea, Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Shea, Corporal Jared Shoemaker, Lance Corporal Keontae Snow, Staff Sergeant Josh Stone, Major Keith Takabayashi, Corporal Tyler Trivilone, Staff Sergeant Alan Walker, Corporal Matthew Wargo, Staff Sergeant Jeremy Woodruff, Major Alan Ziegler. The United States Air Force, Colonel Dick Baddock, the meanest, Louis Araz Chang, Captain Scott Craven, Captain Patrick Flanagan, Lieutenant Colonel Vernon Francis, Lieutenant Colonel Greg Giletti, Captain Nicholas Jose Gori Galzari, Lieutenant Alan Hooks, Lieutenant Wes Kissel, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Nellinger, Lieutenant James Merrill, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Morales, Captain Victoria Pinckney, Lieutenant Laura Piper, Major Adriana Vorderbruggen. The United States Navy, Lieutenant Jared Allen, Lieutenant Commander Tom Blake, Lieutenant Glenn Campbell, Hospital Corpsman John Fralish, Lieutenant Brian Hoke, Lieutenant Junior Grade Nick Geron, Lieutenant Jason Crowder, Lieutenant James Merrill, Gunner's Mate Sean Michael Pushian, Gunner's Mate Luke Rimo, Lieutenant James Search, Lieutenant Wes Van Dorn, Ensign Van Wilson. The United States Coast Guard, Seaman Sean Davenport, Marine Science Technician John Lewis, Captain John Miller, Lieutenant Paul Perlt, Commander Mike Smith, Captain Douglas Whitmer. When you return home today, tell them of us and say for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Now, for those that are willing and able, please rise for the playing of the national anthem.